welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast, and I have another Jessica with the same last initial as me. I just realized that on the podcast with us today, and she's an author, so I'm going to let her tell us about herself.
I'm Jessica Chiarella. I'm a writer from Chicago, and my newest book, The Lost Girls, is out July 6th of this year. So I'm very excited about it, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
I'm super excited because this is a book that is meta here.
Yeah,
there is a podcast in your book, and Here we are on a podcast. And there was a recent book I did like a few months ago. I interviewed Eliza Jane Brazier for If I Disappear, which was also kind of like a meta, one of those moments where it was like looking in that hall of mirrors, and very, very interesting. But your book, it approaches it from a really great place. I come from the generation of it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Every time I would have breakfast, there were pictures of lost children staring me in the face from my milk carton. There was even a book called The Face on the Milk Carton. So to approach a story of a true crime podcast from one of the points of view is a young woman whose sister was kidnapped was awesome. Obviously, the things that happened were very sad, but the premise it felt very tangible, and it felt very much like I was again sitting there with my Fruit Loops looking at the picture of a missing child and just having all of those questions. So tell us about the book and then where the story came from.
So the book, it centers on the main character is Marty Reese, and she, as you said, has a sister, an older sister, who went missing when she was 8 years old. And she was actually the last person to see her sister Maggie before she disappeared. She got into a car and was never seen again. And Marty has sort of spent her entire life looking for her sister. She's created these elaborate fantasies about what her sister might have been doing that would have kept her away from her family. She's, spent all of this time sort of combing through Chicago for her. She's had relationships with all of these different personnel and, all these different municipal offices in Chicago, including the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. And, basically to just continue to keep Maggie on people's radars, to keep her sister in the minds of people who are looking for these missing women in Chicago. And, the idea sort of came to me of like, who in our society do we allow to be seekers? Who are the people who, are able to investigate things? There's the police, there are private investigators, there are journalists. And now we have there's this cottage industry of amateur investigators who use the internet, who use podcasting specifically and are sort of woven into true crime, who we, give this agency to look for people, to try and solve these mysteries, even though they might have no professional expertise at all. So I thought creating a context in which a body shows up at the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, this, secretary who she has maintained this relationship with for a long time to sort of keep Maggie on her radar, calls her and says, "We've got a body. It could be your sister. Like, I recognize enough details." And then having that spur her into creating a podcast that would document this event made sense to me. It sort of, to put it in a narrative structure, felt like what I would do as a writer. And so, allowing this character to say, okay, now I'm going to tell the story of my sister before I figure out whether or not the body of this person who has shown up at the medical examiner's office is her. felt really true to sort of what I imagined a person would do in that situation. And then it sort of spins out from there. Like that is just, the sort of first 20 pages of the book. And then she, because the podcast that she creates becomes such a sensation in the true crime arena, people start contacting her with leads, and she gets this one particular lead from this other character named Ava, that, sort of creates the overall mystery of the story of whether or not these two cases are connected and what that means for both of these characters.
So there's a lot that happens in Marty's family because she's so obsessed with getting her sister back. And, as an 8-year-old child, that has to be deeply traumatic. And I can't really fault her. She was an 8-year-old child, and a lot of things that I've read about families whose children have gone missing, you don't come out unscathed. I remember when I was a child, there was a movie based on a true story called I Know My First Name is Steven. And Steven Stainer eventually did show up again, but it's a very sad story. And not only about him, but what happened with his brother is another crazy story, which I'm not going to talk about, but I think our listeners, if you feel like going down a rabbit hole and you have a strong stomach, you could do that.
Yeah.
Did you do a lot of research into the effects of missing children, or just, investigation and sort of how true crime podcasts may hinder or help these cases?
I mean, I listen to a ton of true crime podcasts, so I feel like that right off the bat sort of gave me a lot of background knowledge about the subject, because family members often play integral roles in those. It's their stories seem to be the ones that are the most memorable. It's the people who are sort of left in the wake, and and I think that's what drew me to the idea of a true crime podcast to begin with, which is it's not so much about, it's about the investigation, but the investigation is sort of woven in with these incredibly personal, deeply felt stories that made, you're talking about growing up, the face on the milk carton, for me, it was always the evening news. And it was seeing these, 30-second tidbits of this kid went missing, this woman was found, and there's no context, there's no story. True crime seemed to allow access to the lives of these people and create actual narratives around their stories that I had never seen before. And so for me, it felt really deeply empathetic in a way that I had never seen before when it comes to crime and stories around crime. Even in, TV, up until sort of the renaissance of TV, you only saw, the investigator, and maybe you would get their story. But, in terms of the family, in terms of deeply felt fallout from true crime, there wasn't, a lot to be had. So I think that's what drew me to these podcasts. And I just listened to tons of them to distract myself from, everything that happened for the past few years in reality. And so I feel like there's a part of me that wonders if a lot of people go to these stories for that specific reason, that there is something so comforting about the empathy which with they're created, that it helps us make sense of a violent world. It helps us connect with people that we don't know. And so in terms of research, I mean, to just circle back to your original question, I just listened to a bunch of these podcasts, and I read a few newspaper articles about the siblings of people who had gone missing. But really, I feel like the primary sources of the podcasts that are out there gave me pretty much everything that I needed to know right off the bat.
There's a sense of control that comes with that. And I think that that's why there's so much that people talk about. And by the way, your book has been getting such good reviews.
Oh, thank you.
Which, congratulations. Well deserved. And there's a lot of talk about why women in particular are drawn to true crime. And there's, like I was saying just a second ago, there's a sense of control in it, because you really, like, you get to sort of go down a rabbit hole and you get to speculate. And then I think people start to wonder, well, would I have done anything different? Or maybe, they start to think themselves about what could have happened. The 24-hour news cycle is very different than the Face on the Milk Carton world. I would be falling asleep while I would hear the evening news talk about something awful that happened. But that would pretty much be it. With social media, you can't escape it. I do like very much that you wove in Ava's story as well.
Yeah. And that sort of I drew right from Serial. I mean, that was, of course, the big true crime podcast that everyone listened to. And that really, that story, I think, stuck with me in a way that, so few others have. There are so many, and they all have, the elements to them which make them particularly powerful. But that one, I think, the idea of the friend who, like the family friend who just cannot stop trying to relitigate this case. For me, so the Ava character, her brother is in prison for a crime that she believes to her core that he did not commit. And she's discovered some malfeasance in the police investigation, and she's trying desperately to get his conviction overturned. And she's found this link between the murder that he has been convicted for and then Marty's sister's disappearance, and brings it to Marty, and the two of them sort of start investigating together. And I think, for me, that came right from Serial. It's like, what is it like to be that person who feels like there was this tremendous miscarriage of justice and can do very little about it? And and you're right, the idea that normal people, people with no background skill set, no professional training, are sort of given agency. It does give you back this feeling of control, where not only are you given such a depth into these stories that you probably have never heard before, but also in so many of these cases, it does have an impact on the legal case when there's a lot of media attention drawn to issues within, a conviction or an investigation that, went in a different direction. There's nothing like public attention to really, light a fire under people. So I think there is something so compelling about the idea that your average person, your average at-home podcaster, could look at a case's details, lay them out in a way that maybe would not hold up in a court of law, or did not the first time around, but makes so much sense to people that their opinions almost become more important than whether or not you can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that does give us back as citizens a sense of control that we, didn't have before.
I think just the onset of podcasts in general, because I was thinking about reality television and how much reality is really in that. But the inception of podcasts as the entity that it's become was really a bunch of people who decided to MacGyver this whole empire of their own show, whereas decades ago it wouldn't really be possible. And there's so much of it out there. So there's a lot about that too when we talk about agency and podcasts and true crime podcasts. So Marty makes some questionable choices in her personal life.
Oh, she does. Yep.
Yeah. Did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I do. And I think this is the part of the book that was perhaps the most interesting. Developing the overall arc of the plot and the investigation and what details were going to become important and what weren't, that was a lot of fun. That was like me and a friend, sitting, hashing out, in a bar in Chicago, just figuring out, okay, like how should this unfold? And so that was, that was a great time, but it was really delving into Marty's psychology that was sort of the meat of it for me, because she was 8 years old when her sister disappeared. She felt tremendous survivor's guilt. And she spent her life feeling like nothing can be right for her if she does not find a way to figure out what happened to her sister. And, when someone is walking around with that sort of open psychological wound and has sort of been dealing with the fallout that happened to her family ever since, there is a part of me that just feels like that person gets a lot of latitude in terms of being a character who can make very, very, very bad choices and have an audience still root for them. And that's sort of my sweet spot, which is like, I love books that have, protagonists that do bad things, even if they are good, well-intentioned people. And even if they're not good, there is a part of me that feels like we don't give a lot of latitude, particularly to women in books, to behave very badly. A lot of times, especially growing up, a lot of the YA that I was reading when I was a kid, and I think it's very different now, but when I was a kid, it was like the female protagonist was always trying to do the right thing, always a good person, like never got into trouble. You were sort of given that as a default. And it wasn't until I was 15 years old and my mom handed me a copy of White Oleander that I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is a character who is not trying to be good and not trying to do the right thing, and is sort of trying to just interact with the world on her terms and with the damage that she is sort of walking through the world with. And so ever since then, I feel like I've always been drawn to characters who are allowed a little more societal latitude because of what they've been through to behave badly and not be seen as a terrible person. She has, and it's all sort of spurred by this body that shows up at the morgue. She's doing a very good job of pretending to be normal. And she talks about, that it's the skill that she's developed, hiding all of her tells, hiding her obsession with her sister. She gets married, she goes to college, she's like having this very successful life. And then this body shows up at the medical examiner's office that could be her sister. And she goes completely off the rails. And it's sort of runs in parallel to this tremendous success that she has with this podcast. She's, unpacking everything for this public medium. And then at the same time, her private life is absolutely collapsed and she has a huge number of affairs, and she behaves very, very badly, and she, casts aside essentially a very good man and loses everything. Her family dislikes that she's getting a divorce, and so they cut ties with her. And it's just, there is a part of me that likes working in that space of like how badly does someone get to behave depending on what they've been through. And so that's just a fun space to explore as a writer and see how much the reader will tolerate from that person.
Are you working on another book, or are you taking a break?
I am. I'm always working on multiple projects, and it's funny because this is the first thriller I ever wrote. I've sort of grew up, in this space of speculative fiction. So like elements of sci-fi, elements of magical realism. So I'm still working on my MFA thesis from now 6 years ago, which is a multi-generational tale of women in Chicago who can all see death by touching people.
That sounds awesome.
Oh my gosh,
I would read that. Please send it to me. That sounds great.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's so much fun. It's also gigantic because it's, historical. So it's involved so much research, and I think it's in the 400-page range right now. So I really need to wrangle it. And then I just started a new thriller as well, because there's nothing more fun than sort of moving between genres and learning the ways in which you interact with an audience and a reader in different genres and sort of playing in different areas. So I've had a tremendous amount of fun with that.
This has been super fun. I hope to talk to you again about something else, anything that you want to talk about.
Absolutely, anytime.
Or one of your books. That works too.
Definitely.
If so this book is out in July, and if people want to find any more information, where can they find you?
I'm at Jess_Chiarella, pretty much everywhere. You can just Google my name, Jessica Chiarella, my website, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I've got slightly different handles on each, so it doesn't really make sense to read them all off. But yeah, just Google my name. I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. So once again, this was Jessica, and my guest was another.
Jessica Chiarella. It's so nice to meet you, Jessica. It was so lovely to talk to you.
We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.